Well, I think we'll start. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon to those joining from Kenya. My name is Peter Ryde, and I'm the Marketing Director for ClimateCare. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. In a moment, I will hand you over to our two experts at ClimateCare, Tom Morton and Matt Gilbert. He will spend the next 25 minutes to introduce you to Aqua Clara drinking water project and to share with us some of the positive impacts that is having on both our climate and the local communities. But before I do, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping rules to help us. The first is that the webinar will be recorded and it'll also be available to you after this morning's session. Throughout the duration of the webinar, you will also be placed on mute, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions to our speakers at the end of the session. If you wanted to submit any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and as I say, those questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Matt, and we can begin the webinar.
Morning, everyone. And as Pete said, good afternoon to any of those in Kenya. I'll hand over to Tom quickly to introduce himself.
Hi, good day, everyone. My name's Tom Morton. I'm one of the directors of ClimateCare, and I run our office here in Nairobi, Kenya, where we've been established for just over 10 years now. And I'll be talking to you as part of the team about the Aqua Clara project and how it works in the field.
And I'm Matt Gilbert, just quickly introduce myself, and I work in the marketing team here at ClimateCare. So I aim to promote the work of ClimateCare and its partners in reducing emissions and delivering sustainable development outcomes. And today we're going to cover four things primarily. So we're going to talk about the Aqua Clara project and the issues that the project aims to address, how it goes about doing so, how this in turn cuts carbon emissions globally, and finally, how you can support this vital work. So firstly, the issues that the project aims to address. Now, health risks can arise from consumption of contaminated water, including all of the diseases listed by the World Health Organization there: cholera, diarrhea, dysentery, typhoid, and all sorts of others, all of which can indeed be fatal. And so the solution to that is to drink safe water. And this is defined as potable water free from harmful microorganisms and substances. And as you can see there, it lists substances as well as microorganisms, because contaminants can be inorganic, like toxic chemicals, or even radiological hazards like nuclear waste. And the safety and accessibility of drinking water are major concerns throughout the world. 29% of the world population do not have an on-site safe water source, and 10% of the world population do not have a safe water source at all. So it really is a problem across the world, particularly in Kenya, where the Aqua Clara project works. Fewer than half of Kenyans have access to safe drinking water. So a significantly lower percentage than globally. And so instead they collect water from open rivers and streams and other unsafe sources, which can lead to the diseases touched on earlier. This has profound health implications. Approximately 80% of hospital visits in Kenya are due to preventable diseases. And of those 80%, 50% are wash related. So that's water and sanitation. The majority of the people that go to hospital for those preventable diseases are from poor communities and live in rural or semi-rural areas, which means that getting to hospital and the care they require can be a real struggle financially and logistically. The current provision is the way it is for a number of reasons. local authorities and the government of Kenya can't keep up with providing safe water to all of its citizens due to the rising demand and also population growth. And so a number of actors have tried to step in, and even this can be problematic sometimes. So NGOs and charities often try and provide boreholes attached to the pump, which you can see there. But problems persist with ownership in situations like this. So if the pump needs maintenance, for example, it's sometimes assumed that this will be covered by the actor that installed the pump. And so it falls into disrepair and becomes unusable. Sustainability is also an issue here, as charities and NGOs obviously have limited funds. So the scale of the support required is constrained. And then on the flip side, there are businesses aiming to address these problems, but naturally they tend to target the more lucrative end of the market, which tends to be middle income urban residents. Bottled water in particular is popular, and certain other filters tend to be sold to the higher end of the market. And so this leaves a significant void to be filled in terms of provision of safe water in Kenya. And this is Aqua Clara's niche. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Tom to talk a bit more about how the project improves lives and reduces emissions.
Thank you very much, Matt. I thought before I started, I'd just give you an introduction to the filter itself. So hopefully Matt has fixed it so that you can see me on the video. And I have next to me one of the Aqua Clara water filters, and I'll just tell you a little bit about it. The dirty water, or the raw water as we call it, goes in there, and you pour that in the top. The active filter element, which is a hollow fiber membrane, sits between the two buckets, and the safe water comes out of the bottom. Now, in fact, at my house, we drink rainwater that we collect from our roofs. So although the water in the top looks clean, it can, of course, carry bacteria and even E. coli if there are things living in the water tank. And of course, although this water is clear, many people actually have to filter what we call turbid water, which is cloudy water, which might come from a dirty spring or a river. So I hope that gives you a bit of context about the filter itself. So how does the project improve lives? If we could go on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to go back to the presentation rather than myself. The key thing it does is it to affordable water filters. But as well as that, it provides training to households on water, sanitation and health issues, therefore creates awareness and education, and it also provides support for maintaining the filters themselves. And of course, it creates value throughout the supply chain by providing 20 full-time jobs and 150 part-time jobs for the community health workers, many of whom are selling the filters to households. We'll come back to more of that later. If I go to the next slide. Aqua Clara Kenya is our implementation partner. And here we have Peter Kihuria and John Nyangwecha at the B-Lab Africa, East Africa launch last year, because one of the things that we share with Aqua Clara is that ClimateCare and Aqua Clara are both registered B Corps. And we are also in the top 10 best for the world as well. And Aqua Clara Kenya is part of Aqua Clara International, which comes from, which is headquartered in Michigan, USA, who are really targeting the underserved communities who do not have access to safe drinking water in their homes. We go on to the next slide, please. So how do the carbon credits support the project? The aim of the project is manyfold. We need to raise awareness about the problems of drinking dirty water and how that can be improved by simple sanitation measures such as provided by the water filter. So all that takes time and it takes money to have those teams out in the field. We also need to help to keep the cost of the filters as affordable as possible. And so a lot of those external costs of awareness raising and demand are covered by the carbon credits so that the filters themselves are kept down at a more affordable price. And also, the cost of about $35 is beyond the reach of many families. At least it's beyond their reach in a single day or a single week or a single month. And so Aqua Clara is able to provide product financing to householders over a 3-month to a 6-month payment period, working with local microfinance organizations. And so what the carbon funding does is it helps all the way along that value chain in providing financial support. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So how does the project improve lives? 80% of householders report reduced incidences of diarrhea, which is a huge number. It's not 100%, and that's because people drink water to a large extent outside the home as well. And once Aqua Clara realized that a number of people in communities were actually accessing dirty water at school, they worked with schools in order to put in institutional filters. And so here you can see Jeffrey, who has an institutional filter. It is very similar to a household filter, but has a much larger storage container, so that more water can be filtered and can be drawn off at break time, for example, or at lunchtime when everyone comes for a drink. But one of the key outcomes of this, and that we hear reported again and again from householders, is that they have less illness in the family, which means a number of things. Firstly, they spend less money on medication, and secondly, their children have fewer days off school. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. One of the things that we mentioned was the cost of the filters being $35 or 3,500 Kenyan shillings, or about £28. That's too much for many people to afford at one go. And so Aqua Clara has really focused with working with microfinance institutions. So what that means is that these are often savings and credit cooperatives. So people save a bit of money over time, and then once they've saved money, they can also borrow money, and they can pay that back to the credit cooperative. But some groups are less formal than that, and maybe women's groups, savings groups, or chamas as they're called, where a number of women, perhaps 20, 30, get together and save together, and then every 10 weeks or 15 weeks, however it is set up, it is your turn to be able to spend the money that is saved. And so working with those really grassroots organizations to help finance the purchase of the filters is a really key part of the project, and that's what the Aqua Clara team is doing out on the ground. So if I could go on to the next slide, please. Aqua Clara has a huge amount of importance now with the COVID-19 outbreak. And because they're at the front line, they are talking about water, sanitation and health within communities. And they've actually extended their work into a very large hand washing program in the western part of the country. And they teamed up with local government and with local healthcare workers to promote hand washing. And here, this is actually not filtered water. It's actually with a sachet added that has disinfectant and flocculant to reduce the turbidity of the water. And these hand washing stations are now being placed in public places and in schools to encourage sanitation as well as drinking clean water. And that is really helping in many parts of the country in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we could go on to the next one, please. So one of the key questions that we're always asked is, how do our projects reduce emissions? And of course, there are many different ways that different projects reduce emissions. If you can imagine a renewable electricity project that is displacing fossil fuel, oil, fired generation from the grid, or is displacing kerosene from someone's kerosene lamp, the emissions are reduced. The emissions calculations are done in a different way compared to here, where people are not boiling water. So let's move on and look at how the project is reducing emissions. In the baseline scenario, which is the scenario that we have before the project, the majority of users are boiling their water to make it safe. And in the majority of households, the main source of fuel is firewood. In fact, biomass, in terms of wood and charcoal, provides 70% of the energy used in Kenya. So that includes all the fuel that is used on the roads and all the electricity that is used in the national grid, and all the water and all the wood used for cooking and making water safe to drink is about 70% of the energy used in Kenya. Now, the challenge there is that that is unsustainable, because the country does not have enough forests, trees, and wood resource in order to replenish the firewood as it is used for cooking. And so the wood resource, we say, is non-renewable. And in fact, only about 20% of the wood that is used regrows in any year. So approximately 80% or 85% of the carbon dioxide released from burning wood is actually very similar to burning fossil fuels, because that wood is not regrowing. So what the water filters do is that they make the water safe, they clean it without the need to boil it. And the calculation is done on how much wood is saved from each household. So we go on to the next slide. Aqua Clara has three main different sorts of filters. And the first filter it uses is called a biosand filter. And the water literally filters through different grades of sand in a very large barrel in people's household. The feedback that they got from the market was that this was very heavy, it was quite expensive. If you moved house, it was very difficult to move, and it was very difficult to move around the house. And there's sometimes a challenge in that you have to draw off water and keep it in a separate container. But the filter that I've just shown you behind me, and the one here in the picture, has really been developed by Aqua Clara over the years in order to fulfill local needs. And the key thing you'll see here is that there's a raw water bucket, and underneath is the safe water bucket that has the tap. And that is a key thing in people's households. They can draw off the water to drink, to wash vegetables, to wash their hands whenever they need. And the calculations demonstrate that the wood saved equates to about 6.5 tons of CO2 saved per household per year, which is very similar, in fact, to the amount of emissions, in fact, more than that used by a typical household in the UK from its gas and electricity usage. Not its entire emissions, but just from its gas and electricity usage, its household energy. So we're on a very similar scale here, but these figures often don't show up in the national statistics, because many of the national statistics, or the ones we read about, only measure the fossil fuel used in a country when those are being reported. So we go on to the next slide, please. One of the key things that we do is monitoring and verification, and that takes place every year to 18 months. And this is my colleague Lillian, who's running a session with users of the filter, actually in a school, and you can see the filter there in the background. And we do a random sample of the households and institutions using each filter. And in order to get to the right confidence level, we go and visit 30 households for each technology type for every year that the filters were installed. So we visit 30 households that had biosand filters installed in 2014, for example, and 30 that had the filter behind me installed in 2019, for example. And added up, that amounts to about 750 households and institutions. And we do two things. Firstly, we interview the householder to find out, is the filter being used? What would they have been using to clean their water instead? Have they had any issues? Is everyone in the household using the water, and various other questions. And crucially, we then take two water samples from each household, one of the raw water and one of the clean water. Those are marked up and they're taken back to the Aqua Clara head office, where those are tested to see whether they have E. coli, either in the raw water and in the clean water. And of course, the crucial part is to show that the clean water in fact contains no E. coli. We then write a monitoring report that reports on the number of filters in use, and we carry out the carbon calculations. That is verified by a third party called a validation and verification body, who comes to do a field visit every year. And then once that has been verified by that body, their report is sent to the gold standard, who reviews the report, asks a few clarification questions, and then issues the emissions reductions into the registry. So we go on, please. And the next section is on how you can support Aqua Clara, and I'm going to hand back to Matt, but don't worry, you can ask me questions about that section that I've just talked about in a few minutes.
Thanks very much, Tom. Super helpful for the listeners, I'm sure, and really gave credence to the sophistication of the calculations that go into the emissions reductions. And it's, of course, this is how ClimateCare helps to finance the project. So just to reiterate that carbon finance, as touched on earlier, right, it supports all the parts of the Aqua Clara business, and it is absolutely essential to the project running. In order to keep operating, it needs carbon finance to subsidize the filters and support the work of awareness driving and the research and development of new filter types. And carbon finance here, we're talking about the sale of those carbon credits that were released after each verification. As the exclusive seller of Aqua Clara credits, offsetting your emissions through ClimateCare means you can support this work. And doing so, you can do it in different number of ways, depending on the size of your carbon footprint. This roughly splits into two categories, which is as an individual or a small or medium enterprise, or a larger organization, and I'll explain why. So for the former category, you can use our calculator on our website, climatecare.org, to offset your residual emissions. And some of that money will go towards supporting the Aqua Clara project. The calculator transactions that go through it supports a number of projects called a portfolio, our Climate Plus Care portfolio. And Aqua Clara is one of those projects. So any transaction that goes through that will help support the vital work of the Aqua Clara project. And as a larger organization, we can do something a bit more bespoke. And here we're talking about a footprint of around about 2,000 tons. If your carbon footprint is around that, or even as a small or medium enterprise, sometimes footprints vary, then get in touch using the details at the end, and we can talk a bit more about how you can support the Aqua Clara project outside of a calculator transaction, and even exclusively if it's a project that really has touched you, then you can offset your emissions potentially just by supporting the Aqua Clara project. And finally, I just want to show a couple of project impacts that Tom has touched upon, but I think they really go to show just how transformative this project can be. Each day, 1.2 million litres of safe water is produced by Aqua Clara products, which is a truly astonishing amount. And it is a bit abstract, so to put that in terms, 193,000 people can access safe water through Aqua Clara's products or its trainings, which are equally important. Environmentally speaking, the project has reduced emissions globally by over 175,000 tonnes of CO2, and that's about 40,000 tonnes every single year. So it really, really hugely impacts the environment in a positive way. And finally, economically as well, 20 full-time and 150 part-time jobs are created, and also supports value in the supply chain, as Tom mentioned, with local suppliers of the plastics for the filters and manufacturing. So it really does have huge economic impacts within Kenya. So I hope that's been an interesting introduction to the project. So we took you through the issues that it tries to address, and then Tom gave you an introduction to the project's positive impacts and how it reduces emissions. And I gave you a little bit of information about how you can support the project. We're going to stop there and take a bit of a breather, but please do contribute questions. And I'll hand back over to Pete now to facilitate the Q&A. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you, Matt and Tom. That was really inspirational. Great project. As I say, we'll give you a moment to draw breath before we start to head into our Q&A session. And thank you to those who have already submitted questions. And just a reminder that you can submit any questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But before we head into our first question, if you found this morning's session interesting and want to learn more, we do run a series of these webinars that range from an introduction to carbon offsetting right the way through to providing an overview as to projects such as the one today. And the best way to stay in touch really is to follow us on LinkedIn. So if you can go to ClimateCare and follow, and we can stay in touch that way. Right, so I can see that we have several questions coming in, so I'll just jump straight into the first question, and this can go to either Tom or Matt. And the first question asks, do people really boil water to drink?
Yes, they do. And that is one of the questions that we ask. If you are using piped water as your main water source, then under the gold standard methodology, then you're not eligible for carbon credits with a water filter. In the survey that we do, both before the project and every year, we ask people how they do make their water safe, and a proportion use non-thermal means of making their water safe. They use chlorine tablets, for example, to make their water safe, and so those people are excluded from being from us claiming carbon credits if they do buy an Aqua Clara filter, because they were not using wood in the baseline. So of the remainder, which is about 90% of people, there are the majority of those do boil water, and some of them don't boil water, but they would if they were able to. Why do they not boil water? Normally for two reasons. One, because wood is very, very scarce, and secondly, because they can't afford it, because they might be buying the wood rather than collecting it themselves. And so what this does is this helps people have access to clean water without necessarily making their clean water through dirty means in the first place. So the vast majority of people really do boil their water, and those that don't, because they can't afford it, or there is not enough wood because it's been denuded already, then we don't want to exclude them for the programme, and so the gold standard allows those to be credited as well, bringing much needed finance to the project.
Great, thank you. Next question then, and we're staying on the topic of the filters, of the water filters themselves. So the next question asks, where are the filters made? Are they made locally?
I can take this one if you want, Tom.
So there are two key parts to the filter, which you should be able to see here. And the aim is to create as much value in Kenya as possible. And so, in fact, one of the beautiful things about this is that the two key components, which are simply two plastic buckets. In fact, I actually had one of these very plastic buckets at home myself, and it did bring a smile to my face the first time that I saw the filter, because it's actually made of exactly the same bucket. The only part that is imported is the filter element, which is made of hollow fiber, which is a very specialist piece of equipment, and that is not made in Kenya. But the rest of it is and then assembled here in the country. In fact, assembled by the householder with training from the Aqua Clara staff.
Fantastic. So I think we've got time for at least one question. More of a question around offsetting here. And the question is there a risk that carbon offsetting discourages the longer term decarbonisation?
Matt, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So when it's done correctly, that's really not a risk that needs to be worried about. Actually, there was research a couple of years back that showed that, in fact, the opposite is true. That those organisations and individuals that do offset their emissions have a better, a more thorough carbon management decarbonisation plan in place than those that didn't offset their emissions. So offsetting is absolutely a tool, a vital tool in the fight against climate change, but it is there to finance emissions reductions and act as an incentive to decarbonise. And that is effectively done when a reduction plan is in place, and that is much more likely to be in place for those individuals and organisations that do offset their emissions than those that do not. So it really is proven that offsetting goes hand in hand with decarbonisation rather than replaces it.
Great.
Exactly. And if I could just add to that, in our experience, it's actually the organisations who are most forward thinking and have reduced their emissions as much as they can already who tend to offset their emissions, not those who are taking no action at all.
Marvellous. So we're going back to the next two questions coming in. Actually, the next question, we go back to the filters themselves, and can you briefly tell us how or what the lifetime cycle is of the biosand filter, please?
Yeah, sure. The biosand filter typically lasts up to 10 years if maintained properly. The outside of the biosand filter is, in fact, a larger water tank, larger than the version you see here, and the sand itself is actually maintained by the householder by agitating the sand on a periodic basis, and then that sand can be replaced if needed. But normally agitating the water, the sand in the tank, and then drawing off the dirty water at the top means that all that turbidity or the solids from the water are actually drawn out of the tank, and then it's left to settle and will produce clean water again after that cleaning. So in fact, it's very simple technology, and apart from the twist on the tap, there are no moving parts, and so it can be kept going for many, many years.
Great. You've got time for one final question, and this one's just come in, and it asks, is the cost to the household covered by our donations, or do they still have to pay?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things that we're very clear on here is that the householders buy the filters. So it's often found that where householders purchase the filters, then they have real buy-in, so to speak, and real ownership over the filter, and it becomes a key part of their household and their lives. And in many cases, it's a status symbol in the community. It's because they have been able to afford the technology to have the clean water. And once they are invested in it, quite literally with funds, then it's shown that the longevity and use of the equipment and the filters can go on for much longer. So what the carbon credit monies which you buy to compensate for your emissions goes towards, which is one of the things that I mentioned earlier, is a lot of the peripheral costs of running the organization, doing the community outreach, of doing the training, of doing the water sanitation and health education, doing the maintenance, and doing the regular follow-up to all the households. What that does is that makes the filter itself much more affordable. And so what you're doing is the carbon funds are covering a large part of the costs, but the filters are not given away. And in that way, it's a truly sustainable model, and people can make a livelihood from selling the filters as well, because of course they make a margin as well, and therefore encourages them to sell more filters and therefore have a greater outreach.
Great. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your questions. I think we're fast running out of time, so any further questions that you do have, please feel free to contact us. Email your questions direct to Matt. His email address is on the screen there, and we'll obviously endeavour to answer them as soon as we can. So on that point, on behalf of both Tom and Matt and myself, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your time this morning. And until we speak soon, please stay safe, and look forward to speaking soon.
Thanks
again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.